My lecture is sort of on the Rockefeller Initiative. That's what Steve wanted me to do, and the presidents. But I want to talk about the best evidence, because I've got some evidence, and what I want to do is to try to get you the best evidence, because that's what happened to me. I had my sightings. I knew what I saw. I knew it was probably extraterrestrial. It was very weird. And I just wanted to find out who knew the answer to this. So I'm busy. That's all I've been doing, is to try to figure out who knows what's going on. And I want to try to get as much of that information to people around me, because I know you're probably looking for the same answer I have. So this was the Rockefeller Initiative. This was when Lawrence Rockefeller went to President Clinton, and they put out a document called the Best Available Evidence document. And what Rockefeller was doing is taking the best evidence he could, and he was putting it out there, and he sent it to 1,000 people. Billy Graham got a copy, Kissinger got a copy, Bill and Hillary Clinton got a copy, all sorts of ambassadors got copies. Next slide. These are some of the documents I'll be talking about tomorrow. This is a critical document. You really can't read this, but I'll be talking about the document section tomorrow. This is a very critical document I'm going to talk about tomorrow that comes out of Canada. The Canadians shut down their UFO program about the same time the Americans did. You'll hear these stories that the Canadians are declassifying stuff. They're not declassifying anything. They did exactly the same thing as the Americans in the late 60s. They shut the program down, and they have not done anything since. They're playing the same game. There's no ETs. There's no evidence. This is an important document out of 1969. What happened in Canada, there was a number of different agencies that were involved. There was the Royal Canadian Mounted Police were involved, the Defense Department was involved, and the Department of Transport was the key one that was involved. When they shut the program down, all the documents were moved to the National Research Council in Canada. This is a letter written from the Defense Department to the National Research Council in 1969, and basically what they say, next slide. Can you go to the next slide? Okay, it talks about in the middle paragraph here, it basically says that the Department of Transport has sent files. Attached to all these files is Project Magnet. Project Magnet is the key study that was done in Canada. It was done by the Department of Transport. What this says is that you will see that Project Magnet is attached to this report. So all the files from Project Magnet are coming, and what he says is that inside is the confidential discussions inside the Department of Transport, and he said, it says, at no time should this be made available to the public. So basically what you have is a guy saying that this stuff is here, and what I say is going on is they'll release the sighting files. They could not care less. You get the little sightings, what's going on, they don't care about that. The discussion inside, like with the Prime Minister, with the President, with the top military people, you're never going to see that. All you're going to see is the sighting files. So here it says, at no time should this file that talks about the internal discussions that are going on, no time should be made available to the public. Next slide. At the very end of the document, the last paragraph says, this file should be destroyed, but not be destroyed until the subject of UFOs has cooled off. So the internal discussion is supposed to be destroyed. Next slide. This is one of the ones they missed. And Stanton Friedman, I think he's still here, Stanton had a big part in this. You'll see his name on the bottom of this document. Stanton had a big part in pushing this out in about 1978. And what this is called the top secret. We call it the top secret memo. This is a memo that was written in Canada. This is page 1 of it. Let's go to page 2. Next slide. Page 2, this is an important one. And for a number of years, I've talked about this. Stanton has talked about this. This is one of the few top secret documents in UFOs that is not disputed by the government. The Canadian government does not dispute this is a real document. It's in their archives. They produced this document. And what the document says on page 2 is this. He says, and this what happened is the Canadians went to the Americans in 1950. This is November of 1950. They want to find out if the flying saucer thing is real. They go to the Americans. They go through the military attaché at the Canadian Embassy in Washington, D.C., and the military attaché goes to the American military and says, what's the deal? They gather the material together. The material is put in this final report, this top secret report that goes to the Canadian government. Point number 1, the matter is considered is the most highly classified subject in the United States. It's rated higher even than the hydrogen bomb. The hydrogen bomb would not be detonated. The first test would not be done until 2 years after this document was written. Number 2, flying saucers exist. The American officials told the Canadians flying saucers exist. They've been playing a game ever since. The modus operandi is unknown, but there's a small group headed by Dr. Vannevar Bush, who was the science advisor to President Roosevelt. So they say that Vannevar Bush is running the organization that is in control of flying saucers, trying to figure out what's going on. The entire matter is considered to be of tremendous significance. That's the fourth part. What I'm going to add now, and I can't get into it tonight, if you see my consciousness lecture, I talk about the importance of consciousness to this phenomena. Where it comes from is the very next line in this document. I had an inspiration last year at Phoenix. I saw a lecture. Everything's 35 years of material. All just suddenly came together in my head, and I suddenly realized what the significant key to this whole thing is, and it's consciousness. The next line says, I was further informed by American officials, not guys on the street, not little people who have seen flying saucers, by American officials that other things might be associated with the flying saucers, such as mental phenomena. That the Americans aren't doing very well because they have said to us that if we have anything, they're willing to exchange credentials and talk to us about this mental phenomena thing. So in 1950, the Canadians were told by the Americans that mental phenomena was associated with the saucers. The reason that is so important is because Betty and Barney Hill, their book would not become public till 16 years later. The first contactees who talked about interacting with aliens did not come out until November of 1952. 2 years before, the Canadians and the Americans knew that mental phenomena was a key part of this mystery. Now, what came to my head last year, and this is my short consciousness lecture, things that had happened that people had said suddenly made sense. One of the things happened, and this is in the book that we've just released, Dr. Eric Walker. We get this guy, Dr. Eric Walker, from Penn State University. He's got 14 honorary doctorate degrees. He was chairman of the board of the Institute for Defense Analysis, which is the major military think tank in the United States. He was chairman of the National Science Foundation. He was executive secretary of the Research and Development Board, which was in charge in 1950, at the time when this memo was written, of all the weapons in the United States of America. He was president of Penn State University, the Ivy League Engineering College, for 15 years. He confirmed to us in the first interview he was at a set of briefings at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So what happens is we get a series of researchers, about 6 or 7 researchers, who chase him around for 8 years trying to get him to talk. And in one of the interviews, we're trying to get him to talk about, Stanton was talking about MJ-12. We're trying to get him to confirm, MJ-12, how many people are on the group? Is it all Americans? What's going on? And suddenly he cuts us off and he says, let me ask you a question. What do you know about ESP? And the guy that was interviewing him from Britain really didn't have an answer. I don't even remember what the answer was. He had no answer. And Walker answered his own question. He said, look, unless you understand about ESP and how it works, you will not be taken in. And he's referring to the MJ-12 group. You will not be taken in. Very few people understand how it works. So in 1950, the Canadians were told that mental phenomena was involved. In 1991, in an interview, Dr. Eric Walker tells us that ESP is the key to the whole thing. And then in 1993, Ben Rich is giving a lecture at UCLA to the graduating alumni for engineering, and is in there. Everybody knows the first part of the story. He shows the slide. The last slide he shows is a flying saucer, and he says, we now have the technology to take ET home. We've discovered the mistake in the equation. It's going to take an act of God to get this thing out of Congress because it's so deep black. 2 of the people in the room are Keller and Jan Harzen. And Jan Harzen, they race after him. They realize this is the opportunity of a lifetime. Here's the guy who runs Skunkworks, Black Ops, Stealth, all the U-2, SR-71. This is the top guy. And he's saying this is for real. They chase him out of the room. Jan Hartson says to him, look, let me ask you a question. What do you mean you've discovered the mistake in the equation? What are you talking about? I'm interested in UFO propulsion. How do the UFOs get here? And Ben Rich is heading for the car. Ben Rich turns around and says exactly what Walker had said 2 years before. He says, let me ask you a question. What do you know about ESP? And Jan Hartson says, well, that just means everything in time and space is connected. And he said, that's how it works. And he gets in his car and he drives off. And if you go to my consciousness lecture, I'll tell you the whole what happened for the rest of the year, all these synchronicity things that people started coming up to me and telling me they're flying the flying saucer and how they fly the flying saucer. And it's just like unbelievable. It just all suddenly made sense. Next slide. So we're going to leave that part. Here's another document I'm going to talk about tomorrow. This is a report that was It was the Project Magnet report. As I said, the Department of Transport was the main unit that was doing the real UFO, the flying saucer. They never called it UFOs. Always called it flying saucers, even after the term UFO came in, because I think Wilbur Smith, who was running the program, knew that the term UFO was just there to muddy the waters. He always called them flying saucers, flying discs. He never called them UFOs. This is his report that sat on the Prime Minister's desk, according to his wife, sat on the Prime Minister's desk for 3 months. At that point, Wilbur and the Prime Minister of Canada decided that the time really wasn't right. This is 1952. Next page of the document. Can we go next slide? This is the first page. But before, let me remind you, there's no proof of extraterrestrials. There's no evidence. There's no cover-up. Okay, next slide. In the top, in this document, and I'll read it. I'll get my glasses on here. It says, this is an official Canadian report that sat on the Prime Minister's desk. It appears then that we are faced with a substantial possibility of the real existence of extraterrestrial vehicles, regardless of whether or not they fit into our scheme of things. So the Canadians basically said, yeah, this is for real. It's probably extraterrestrial, it's for real. Next slide. Wilbur Smith ran in Ottawa, the Canadian capital. He ran, at the bottom here, you'll see the Flying Saucer Observatory. This was an observatory that they set up to detect flying saucers. On August the 8th, 1954, they had 5 different instruments. I talked to somebody who was actually in the room when it happened. The bells went off, they went running out, and they went on record. Wilbur Smith said, unless there's something wrong with the equipment, we've detected the first flying saucer over the nation's capital. Not a good move. 2 days later, they shut the program down. Next slide. This is the flying saucer station shut down, but something still a mystery. Next slide. This is the Canadian Embassy. This is where all the communication went on between the Canadians and the Americans, was at the Canadian Embassy here in Washington. Next slide. This is the Canadian Embassy document. When it said in there the fact that these documents, these internal documents with discussions were to be destroyed, they destroyed these documents. These we found in Smith's personal files. These are actual documents from the Canadian Embassy to Wilbur Smith and back and forth. Next slide, I'll discuss. So here's the third ambassador in the Canadian Embassy writing to Wilbur Smith. There's very little more that can be done here for the present. The official position here, he's talking about Washington, D.C., is still that nobody knows anything. The matter, none knows anything here about the matter at all. We are, of course, keeping our ears and eyes open, and if anything does come down, you will probably hear it through the Wright and Salant channel. These are the military liaison guys who are trying to figure out what's going on in Washington. Next slide. Oh yeah, and on that slide it says, nobody outside of Wright, who's the military attaché, and myself, we've got orders from the ambassador that nobody is to talk about the subject. So there's a clearance. On the second page, they refer at the top here, they say the article, Wilbur Smith, the Canadians actually send an article on UFO propulsion to Vannevar Bush. Vannevar Bush is the guy that's running the American program. So at the top of this document, an official document, it says the article was returned to Kehoe through Wright, who's the military attaché, and he has not heard anything since from Bush or what Bush thought. So they've sent this article to Vannevar Bush, and they're waiting for the article to come back. Now these documents, I guess they managed to destroy all these documents. Next slide. The ambassador and I would be particularly interested in any indication that you may have heard when you were here, they're talking to Smith in Washington, on the possibility of an official U.S. government statement. The Canadians are basically told, yes, there was a crash flying saucer, it went down, this thing's for real, all we know is we didn't build them, we're working on it. So the Canadians in this document are actually sitting there in 1950, late 1950, waiting for the American government to make a disclosure, to announce the fact they've got a crash flying saucer. Now, of course, it doesn't happen, but the Canadians think the statement's coming. They're sitting there on edge waiting for this to happen. Next slide. This is a story, we may not get much into this. This is Francis Swan, this is an FBI document. I think it's an FBI document. FBI investigated her, the CIA investigated her, Navy intelligence investigated her, the Canadians investigated her. She lived just down the road from Betty Hill, had an interaction with Betty Hill, haven't got time to tell the story. But she was in contact with aliens, and she actually taught the CIA how to channel aliens. And there's an incident that occurs in July of 1959 where the CIA, the head UFO guy in the CIA, and 2 Navy intelligence officers actually channel an alien, and the thing flies by the window. And we've got the documents and stuff. So this woman was very important in this early history of trying with the Americans and the Canadians figuring out what's going on. Next slide. This is an incident that involved Mrs. Swan, and this is an incident that Paul Hellyer first announced in 1967, and Paul didn't even know. He wasn't even interested in UFOs at the time. He said he saw UFO stuff when he was Secretary of Defense in Canada coming across. And what happens in 1967, in July, we have a centennial project. So it's the 100th anniversary of Canada. Paul Hellyer is running around the country as Secretary of Defense, and he's opening projects, different projects. And the town of St. Paul, Alberta, decides they're going to have a UFO landing base. They're going to build a UFO landing base, and this is going to be a tourist attraction. And Paul Hellyer goes there to open this thing in 1967. He writes, he gives in the speech, he says, well, this isn't the first time we've had a landing base. He said, we actually had one 13 years ago. There was a top secret committee, and we opened a base called Suffield, which is the Canadian equivalent of Area 51. It's a top secret Army base in Alberta, Suffield, Alberta, no flyovers. And Paul says, well, in this speech, open speech, covered in every newspaper in Canada, that the Canadians actually opened the base for UFOs to land, which sent me and another researcher after Paul Hellyer for a number of years and saying, well, how do the aliens know where to go? Part of the story is missing. And what it was Francis Swan, Wilbur Smith, all these people had said to the Canadian government, if you quit trying to shoot it down, we'll land it. So the Canadians have actually admitted that they opened a base, and they say a small inside group was putting pressure on them. And we know who the group was, we know the whole story, and this was the base they opened for UFOs to land in Canada. This is 1954, the same year that Eisenhower was rumored to have met with the aliens, the same year that Horsley, in the United Kingdom, the guy who's in control of the nuclear weapons in the United Kingdom, tells a story in his autobiography years later that he was visited by an alien in 1954 and told to stop the nuclear weapons, and he wanted to meet with Prince Philip. And 54 is an important year, but the Canadians did open a base, and they admit it. It's on the record now that they opened a base for UFOs to land in 1954. Next slide. This is Goldwater. I mentioned these if you've seen my stuff. If people think there's no cover-up, there's no evidence. This is Barry Goldwater, who for 4 years was chairman of the Intelligence Committee for the Senate. He was the top guy. Let's go to the slides. We'll just go through some of the stuff he wrote. I went to Arizona and recovered all his files. He wrote a lot of UFO letters. They're on my website, 150 pages of UFO letters, whatever. And here's what he says. I made an effort to find out what was inside the building at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and I was understandably denied this request. It is still classified above top secret. There's a secret. There's a cover-up. Barry Goldwater said it is classified above top secret. Next slide. Here he is. Now he's intelligence. He's running the intelligence for Senate right now. This is what he said in a letter as the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. Relative to your question about the accuracy of the details in the Roswell incident, which was the book that Stanton was talking about that was released in 1980, as to the details, they are partly true, but not completely. I can't give you any other answer, so don't push it. Next slide. As chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, he says this thing has gotten so highly classified, it is simply impossible to get anything on it. And he's the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. Next slide. Here at Senate Intelligence Committee, he says, I have no idea who controls the flow of need to know, because frankly, I was told in such an emphatic way that it was none of my business, that I've never tried to make it my business since. Next slide. Here again, Senate Intelligence Committee. I have been interested in this subject for a long time, and I do know that whatever the Air Force has on the subject is going to remain highly classified. And that is, despite what the Obama White House is now saying, no cover-up, Goldwater says absolutely ain't true. Next slide. This is a thing, I'll just do this quickly. This is a documentary that was produced in the early 1970s. I mentioned it very briefly in my testimony the other day. This is a documentary. The government says we aren't involved in UFOs. No, haven't been involved in UFOs. Got out of the program in 1969 with Project Blue Book. This happened about 1973. If this was true, if they had gotten out of UFOs in 1969, they would have just shut up and done nothing, and the story would have gone away. That's not what happened. If they were not involved, if there was nothing to it, then why in 1973, when the fire was about to go out, did they go and throw gas on the fire? They started it all up. They hired, it's called UFOs, It Has Begun. You can find this on the internet. If you Google search this, you will see the 1979 remake. The original one was 1974. It was called UFOs Past, Present, and Future. Next slide. Two producers, Bob Emenegger and Alan Sandler, go to the Pentagon. They do not sign in at the Pentagon. They go and visit this man, who's Bill Coleman, who is the public relations officer for the Blue Book program. They say, on the record numerous times, we signed an actual contract, a movie contract with the Pentagon to make a UFO documentary. So if you're out of UFOs in 1969, why in 1973 are you taking two guys and doing a UFO documentary? They wanted stuff out. Next slide. They're given $250,000 to do this documentary. In the credits, they're told, and the guy that put the money up was MacArthur, the MacArthur Foundation that does all the PBS stuff. John MacArthur. They said, well, Mr. MacArthur, he's having some trouble with some of his friends. He'd rather not have you put his name in the credits. But keep the money. Don't worry about the money. Just don't put his name in the credits. So they get $250,000 to do this documentary, which nobody even knows where the money comes from, but the story has been told where it is. Next slide. They're given a number of films. One of the films is the Holloman Air Force Base film. And they actually put 8 seconds of the film. Now, this may work, it may not. We may not be linked here. But here's the 8 seconds. Go to the next slide. This is the 8 seconds they actually put in. No? Okay. Go back one slide. Okay, this is, you can see the mountains here. And basically, what it is they're allowed to put 8 seconds. In the end, what happens is they're allowed the film. They actually have the film in their possession. It shows 3 different views of a UFO landing. The aliens get out. They're greeted by officials at Holloman Air Force Base. They actually have the film in their possession. Just before the film is to be released, Coleman says, we need the film back. It's Watergate. Time isn't right. We can't release the film. You have to use storyboard. You've got to draw the thing. You can't use the documentary. But they allow them to put 8 seconds of the film into the documentary, which is very, I won't get into, I know why they did it, but they're allowed to use 8 seconds. Okay, go to the next one. This is one that I talked in. Stanton was kind of surprised. I talked about this in the testimony. The government says there's no cover-up. Government says there's no evidence. Bob told me categorically, and he said a number of times, we've got on a number of taped interviews where he said that they were given a bunch of films. NASA, and in fact, in the credits, you'll see they thank the NASA and they thank the Department of Defense for their cooperation on the documentary. They're given a pile of film, including the Holloman film, which is pulled back. They show a bunch of films from NASA, slides from NASA. This is one that they get. It's a launch at Vandenberg Air Force Base. The film shows the downrange, missile going downrange, and 2 UFOs tracking this object. They get the guy who does all the analysis for Blue Book and for the Robertson panel in the 1950s, an expert, to look at it, and the guy says, no, this is UFO. This is not illusion, this is UFO. They've got the film. I said to Bob, so what happened to the film? Did you give it back? He said, no, I think we still got it. I said, what is it? He said, it's top secret. I said, so you got a top secret film that the government gave you, and you didn't give it back? And he said, no. I said, I think Alan's got it in his vault in Oregon. And I said, well, holy cow. He said, yeah, it's got Quintanella's name. The Blue Book commander, it's got Quintanella's name on it. It's got top secret, and I think we still got it. And he checked with Alan, yeah, they still got it. Now, James Fox is trying to get it. James Fox says this is the smoking gun, and they learned it from me that this film was there. It is a smoking gun. James Fox is trying to get this film. So you may actually see this film come up. There's some negotiation as to getting this film. But this was the fact that shows that this stuff about there's no cover-up is total nonsense. Next slide.